At the dawn of football, one team did more than any other to showcase and champion the sport's virtues. They became the world's first iconic football brand, the world's first football superstars, whose travels around the globe would change it forever. They were the Corinthians. Formed in 1882 and made up primarily of Oxford University graduates, the hope of Pa Jackson, their founding father, was to create a side capable of beating Scotland, the then dominant force. Strictly amateur, they quickly built a reputation as a side who played with incredible guile and class. Early exponents of the radical passing game, the Corinthians remain as the only side to have ever fully represented the entire England national team, a feat they achieved not only once, but twice in matches against Wales in 1894. However, by the turn of the century, professionalism increasingly reduced the Corinthians' opportunity to compete against the very best. And although they often enjoyed humbling victories over their professional rivals, such as the record 11-3 victory over Manchester United, they decided that for a fresh challenge they would become football missionaries, spreading the sport around the world. And so, in the years before the outbreak of the Great War, the Corinthians' touring was relentless. Starting with the visits of South Africa in 1897 and 1903, the Corinthians went on to introduce the sport to every corner of Europe and every corner of North America as well, with extensive tours of Canada and the USA. And this famous group of men were a tremendous draw wherever they played, and rarely would they disappoint to put on a show, such as their 18-0 victory against New York City. Continuing on their travels, 1910 saw them for the first time visit South America. Invited by himself a Corinthian, Charles Miller, the man considered to be the father of Brazilian football, the Corinthians arrived in Brazil. First playing and winning 5-2 a match in Rio against the first ever Brazilian national side, the Corinthians travelled on to Sao Paulo, where an 8-2 victory over a local sports club called SPAC inspired the Corinthians' most famous legacy, the formation of Brazil's most celebrated club and FIFA World Champions of 2012, Corinthians Paulista. But tragically, it is a sad truth that this was to be the crowning glory for a remarkable generation. The team had taken football all around the world. They'd beaten the national sides of Germany, Brazil, Holland, South Africa and Belgium. But for them, the tours to Brazil of 1910 and 1913 were to be their last. Today, the great name of the Corinthians lives on through their present-day incarnation, the Corinthian-Casuals. Based in London, the Corinthian-Casuals have continued to abide by the Corinthian ethos of amateurism ever since the club's amalgamation with Casuals FC that saw them formed in 1939. Competing still as the highest-ranked amateur club in England in the semi-professional Ryman League, it is in the club's boardroom that you will find the First World War memorial that tells of the tragic and fateful story of the Corinthians' most celebrated generation. A generation lost far too soon. At the actual moment war was declared in 1914, the Corinthians were on a ship bound for Brazil, where they were due to tour for a third time. On arrival, and on hearing of the news of the outbreak, they returned immediately without kicking a ball in order to join and fulfill their commitments to the British Army. And amongst them were players such as Cuthbert Brisley, a veteran of the earliest tours to South Africa and a man regarded in 1914 to be Europe's greatest striker. He'd scored against Brazil in 1910, and when the war began, served in the RAF, for whom he died for in action. Another great Corinthian was Thomas Rowlandson, one of the great characters of his time. He kept goal for the club no less than 150 times, and embodied the famous Corinthian spirit. The tales of him stepping aside for a penalty have since become legendary. Convinced was he that they weren't in keeping with the ethos of the club to acknowledge a deliberate foul. Rowlandson gave up his own house to the Red Cross before the war, and sadly himself died on the battlefields of the Somme, having survived the Battle of Ypres. and the memorial is littered with such stories as these, a tribute to incredible acts of bravery by the men who in their short lives had changed the world forever, who had taken the sport of football all around the globe only to then die, nobly fighting for its freedom. And wonderful is it that their legacy and influence lives on to this day, in the continued presence of the Corinthian-Casuals and the Corinthians-Paulista, whose white shirts pay tribute every week to the men that originally inspired them. And it doesn't end there, with both the superstars of Real Madrid and England retaining also to this day the white shirts that were originally inspired by the Corinthians. And what more fitting stadium could the 2014 FIFA World Cup in Brazil, opening 100 years after their fatefully unfulfilled tour of 1914, but Sao Paulo's brand new Corinthians Arena. And it was all inspired by the Corinthians' mesmerizing skill and charisma. They were the world's first football superstars, the world's first iconic football brand, with their simple white shirt and crest on their chest, the shirt that took the beautiful game all around the world that first time. They stood for honour, fair play, beautiful football and freedom. The Corinthians deserve to never be forgotten.